because a lot of people don't know who Robert is.
Absolutely. That way we have two Bobs, so hopefully that won't confuse us.
Well, if you put Newman in there.
Right.
So did I.
Come on, YouTube. Mm-hmm. There we go. I think all our technology tends to make us impatient, at least for me. All right, we're muted. All right. I think we're recording. What happened here? There we go. All right, let's begin with a prayer. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. We're getting ready to pray. Pray.
Who's going to pray?
We're praying. Sorry, I'm my soft voice. Lord, we thank you for a new day. We thank you for this community and this time to be together. Thank you for opening our eyes to understand wonderful things in Scripture. Pray for your Spirit's help in our conversation and in our application of what we learn. Pray all this in your most holy name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So we are finishing up Esther today. Has anyone read ahead where you know what's coming? All right. And it's parts of this, obviously, that we'll explain or at least discuss are violent and kind of horrible in our modern way of looking at things. But parts are, you have to, I think, one, allow for that being somewhat hyperbolic, but also allow that this is comic. So a lot of what's going on is really a comeuppance or a someone who is planning great evil against the good guys, against the Jews, or that person is kind of hoisted on his own petard, if you've heard that phrase, I think in Shakespeare, but where what he is planning to do to them comes back on himself. So that's kind of poetic justice, different phrases for that in literature. And this is, in all of literature, it's one of the classic examples of that. So all these schemes, one way, get re-schemed in a different. So last week, because we had a little extra time, we got into chapter 6. But I want to start at chapter 6, verse 1 again and kind of go through it briefly, just so we're all kind of remembering what's going on. The basic first 5 chapters, remember, Vashti is removed as queen, Esther's put in as queen, Haman is elevated as the number 2 person in all the Persian Empire next to the king. Haman has this guy, he is kind of his rival or foil called Mordecai, who is probably a person of influence and Jewish, though that may or may not have been well known. But remember, Mordecai wouldn't stand up and honor Haman, even though he's number 2 in the kingdom. And another kind of subplot is Mordecai helps uncover a plot of people who are going after the king. And so, you know, that plays out and how all this unfolds. But Haman is very full of himself. He's very powerful, rich, has 10 sons, which again is a sign of great influence, that many successors. But because of Mordecai not honoring him, he wants to not just go after Mordecai, which would be bad, but understandable, but wipe out all of Mordecai's people. So once he learns Mordecai is Jewish, he conspires to get the king to come up with a scheme to wipe out the Jewish people. So that is kind of where we are. And then, you know, how are we, you know, and also another plot is Haman has decided, because again, Mordecai continues not to honor him, to hang him. And he has built a 75-foot tall gallows. So a very dramatic way of getting rid of his enemy in addition to wiping out his people. And so all that is playing out as we move into chapter 6. So everything is against the Jewish people, other than, you know, Esther has come in. And she and Mordecai have kind of gone back and forth that for just such a time as this, you may be here to save your people. but everything looks very dark. So let's look at chapter 6. Any questions or comments before we get into the text? Okay. Again, we talked about this first part last week, but that the king can't sleep, and he didn't have Ambien or any of those things. I assume he tried warm milk, but what he decides to do is to have read to him the annals of the king, and we don't know if that's because that's kind of boring reading, or maybe what it appears to be is there's something he's not remembering that he wants to be sure to honor. And in the reading of the annals to the king, something comes out that he realizes he did not recognize Mordecai's great, saving his life. And so he, in verse 3, asked that, what have we done for him? And the servants of the king say, well, we haven't done anything. And so in verse 4, the king said, who is in the court? So this is where the irony starts. Haman's in the court. So he asked the questions, like we said last week, what should we do to honor someone who's helped the king? Now, Haman has just come into the court to get Mordecai. He's just about to have, to tell the king what I'm going to do. Probably needs to kind of get an okay on that. So he is asked by the king, what should be done for someone who the king wants to honor? So Haman gives the list, all the things that you should do. Put royal robes on him, put a crown on his head, let him be walked through the capital with a court official to cry out, this is what's done for someone the king wishes to honor. So, it's a pretty nice list. And then the next twist, the king said to Haman, quickly take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to the Jew Mordecai, who sits at the king's gate. So not what Haman was expecting, but he's forced to do that. So, these two arch enemies, and poor Haman is walking through having to say what a great person Mordecai is. So not only is Mordecai not being forced to stand and honor Haman, he's actually being honored by his arch nemesis. So Mordecai comes back to the king's gate, where apparently he would hang out, which is kind of that place where things would be decided, the public square. And then Haman's like, he's savvy enough to know he's in deep trouble. He goes back to his home, and his wife and his friends, who are his closest advisors, he kind of lets them know what has happened. And his wife, kind of like Job's wife, if Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. So, not exactly probably the message you want to hear, but true. It's almost a prophetic thing that she, again, where God isn't overtly mentioned, is implied that the Jewish people have this special protection, and that because you've gone after them, you're going to be the one that goes down, not them. An interesting thing, I don't know if any of you have read it. I missed it in my initial preparation. I just saw it this morning, is something about Haman's background. Has anyone read about that? He has this kind of mysterious background in the Bible. He is related to, he's an Agagite, if I'm saying that right, but that is a descendant of the king of the Amalekites. If you remember that group, they were kind of this mystery people that came up, and I think first in Joshua as they were coming into the promised land, and then into Judges. And it really led to the downfall of Saul. Remember that story? There was a people that God wanted him to wipe out, and he didn't fully wipe them out. And he actually took their stuff, their booty, all their possessions, which God had specifically said not to do. And just keep that in mind as we read about the Jewish revenge against the decree to wipe them out. So Haman is an Amalekite, and what God ultimately had wanted was for the Amalekites to be wiped out. And it's an interesting little subtext for what's going on. So chapter, end of 16, 14, and then chapter 7. So, his advisors are around him. He's talking, I don't know what I'd be saying if I was Haman. Can I get out of Dodge? Probably hard to get out of Dodge when there's an empire from Ethiopia to India. So, you kind of have to hope you can maybe influence the king. But the king's eunuchs arrive and say, come to the banquet. Don't know if the eunuchs are in on this. And so both Haman and the king come, and they're expecting a big party. Again, remember from the first time that feasts are a big part of Esther. They're get the number 14 or 15 feasts. So this is kind of the if not the last, the close to the last big feast other than Purim, the festival. So it says in verse 2, on the second day. So, these people don't do like a couple hours and you're out. They're doing the second day. They're still drinking wine. So there's an assumption the king may be a little bit inebriated, which seemed to be his condition a lot. So he kind of says, well, let's get to the point. You keep rescheduling this. What is your petition? And again, that phrase, up to half my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. And the queen says, and this is, again, eloquent language, and it's got some irony built in. If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. So, when she first says that, you go, what? That is my petition, and the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, again, that gives you those echoes of the Jewish history, all the way back to Exodus. We have been sold merely as slaves, men and women. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, so if that had been what was up, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king. So it's not only what's being done to the Jewish people, but how that is affecting the king, wiping out this loyal and large group of his subjects. Then the king said to Queen Esther, well, who has done this? Who is he and where is he who has presumed to do this? So you can kind of hear the background music. And the answer is that the king, Esther said, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. So she points across the banquet table, and Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And so just to build, again, more of the, all the drama, the king gets up from his seat and walks out, doesn't say a word. And you can see him maybe out on a terrace walking back and forth and really upset. And so, again, Haman knows I am in deep trouble, and he pretty much knows his life is over. But he stayed to beg for his life from the queen. So he falls at her feet and is begging. So like a supplicant, please, grant me my life, have mercy. And so the king returns and misinterprets what's going on, and that Haman had thrown himself on the couch and where Esther was. And the king says, well, he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house. As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. So they came and put a hood over him, kind of like the old Westerns before you hang somebody. But he is, obviously, I don't think he was assaulting the queen, but that's how it came across to the king. And so that made his anger even more intense, made the issue even more personal. So I'll stop there, but a lot has been unfolding, but what thoughts or questions for where we are right now? Because you kind of know what's going to happen next. I mean, Esther's done a heck of a job of kind of building up, setting one banquet after another, not letting the king know, not letting Haman know. And Haman's kind of already gotten a clue, though it's not related to the queen's plot, but of what's happened in having to honor Mordecai, that things are not playing out the way he anticipated. But any questions, thoughts?
The king is an interesting character as I read through this, you've gone through it.
Yeah.
He is a Gentile, and in this case, the Gentile is the kingly, the strong Gentile is, to me, displayed as a bit of a well-meaning fumble.
I think that's fair.
His wife dissed him, get another wife, real no character here.
Right.
And then Haman is insulted and gets what he wants from the king with a bribe, which the king happily takes.
10,000 talents. So.
And then the king just doesn't quite understand this edict that he's signed on until it's revealed who did it, et cetera, et cetera. So the king just seems to be, throughout this whole story, is a bumbler.
That's
Not
fair.
bad meaning, not well meaning, just whatever.
Yeah, and remember in the beginning, this is written probably in part at least as a critique of the Persian system. And with any satire, there's exaggeration. You know, think of Jonathan Swift, right? That, you know, there is a point being made that's greater than the historical record. And probably a king of Persia would not be quite this stupid. Landon, would you do me a favor? I just realized I'm not mic'd. Would you mind giving the mic for me? Thank you, sir. I hope everybody can hear me all right. I just realized that. The maybe bring the handheld if you don't mind. So
Yeah, do you know where that?
yes, in that right-hand cabinet on the top shelf. Thank you, sir. So yeah, they're definitely portraying the king in a certain way, and this makes me think too. Andy's not on this week, but Andy had asked a question at the end of last week about, well, how do we know it's not true? And I said, it's kind of hard to prove a negative. We were at Clergy conference the last 2 days with a woman who's an expert in historical geography. And so she talks a lot about extra biblical records, archaeology, and all the things that scientists and researchers use to kind of not prove the Bible, but to kind of say, yeah, this story actually has a lot of legs in terms of the archaeological record or the extra biblical public record. But the issue is with Esther, and I asked her because I didn't want to be wrong or lazy, is that it's, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
And maybe, would you mind just letting people use it? That there really is no record of Esther. So there's no record of her as a queen. They've tried different names. There's no real record of this particular king. You know, there's three, where scholars have said it's probably Xerxes who they're talking about. And we had this problem the other day. Let me turn it on. That would help. So you have no record of a decree in the record that would have said this is what happened with where the king sent out an edict to wipe out all the Jewish people. There's no record of people being killed, which 75,000 would be a lot. So all that to say, if it helps you to think of this as history, think of it as history. If you're comfortable with it being more of a story, almost like a parable, that's also in the realm of it being okay. For me, just as a priest of the church, it being historical isn't required for it to be authoritative, if that makes sense. But you, obviously, everybody has their way of interpreting scripture, and that's okay too. Any other thoughts or comments about Esther to this point? Okay. Well, we'll pick up the pace a little bit just to be sure we finish this week. All right. So we're assaulting the queen. Haman is being hooded. So imagine, again, those old Westerns where you put on the hood. Not a good place for him. And he's kind of being, walked out of the king's presence. One of the eunuchs, I have an idea, king. Haman was building this gallows that he was preparing for Mordecai. Why don't we use that for him? And the king says, good idea. And so it's 50 cubits. If you don't know, a cubit's about elbow to fingertip, so about 18 inches as a general rule. So it's a big, 75 feet, huge. So they take him there and kind of walk him up the steps, and then they hang him. So it's pretty simple statement. And that kind of helped the king to calm down, we're told. So Haman is done. But what else is still going on? Is everything finished?
No.
The edict's still in effect.
Right. And what we'll learn in the chapter is once a king's edict goes out, it's kind of like a papal bull, right? In our more current reality, you can't undo those. That's the bull, that's the edict. So that's what we're going to have to live with. But is there a workaround? Again, to use more modern terminology, how can you kind of countermand it in a sense? It's still the edict, but give another edict that might help to keep it from being as devastating as it could be. So the king gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman in chapter 8. So again, remember, he's like the wealthiest or one of the wealthiest people in the land. He has all this influence. So all of that kind of accumulates under the queen. And then Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her, his, her uncle and really her stepfather in a sense. And the king elevates Mordecai. So yeah, I got an opening. So he takes off his signet ring, which I believe Haman had, and that's what you seal the edicts with, and gives it to him. So it's more than a charge card. I mean, it's really giving his sign of office to Haman, to Mordecai. So Esther, who's busy as queen, takes all that she just received from the king, Haman's estate, and gives it to Mordecai. So Mordecai, who again was probably a person of some means, just had his estate increased quite a bit. The queen continues her request. She falls at the king's feet and says, how can we stop the evil design of Haman the Agagite? So again, what I mentioned at the beginning, this descendant of King Agag of the Amalekites, what can we do? So the king pulls out his scepter, which again is this gesture saying, I'm going to grant what you request. And so she stands and says, verse 5, if it pleases the king, and if I've won his favor, so using this courtly language, and if the thing seems right before the king and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman. So, that's what she asked for. And because she doesn't want to see her people wiped out. And the king says in verse 7, see, I've given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he plotted to lay hands on the Jews. You may write as you please with regards to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with a king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. So what I was saying, you can write a new one, but the people who are authorized to wipe out the Jews still have that authority. So they bring in the secretaries, they write this new edict, they write it all the different languages from Ethiopia to India, as well as whatever was the common language of the Persians at that time, and then also in the language of the Jews, because this edict is really going to be sent for the benefit of the Jewish people to help them defend themselves. And then they send it out by the fastest steed. So again, you can see like in a movie scene, they're coming out with all those scripts and they're running out and they're going out to the far corners of the empire. So verse 11, by these letters, the king allowed the Jews who are in every city to assemble, so to organize, in a military sense, and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them with their children and women, and to plunder their goods. So and obviously a blank check and very violent. So, that is authorized and that it's going to happen on a certain day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And so that was sent out as a decree to every province all over the empire. And again, the king's couriers went. So on Mordecai, he is in this new position. He's wearing royal robes of blue, usually certain colors only the king can wear or his court. He has a golden crown. He has all these symbols of authority. And the whole capital, Susa, is like excited and shouting. The Jews are happy. And again, there's joy among all the Jewish people. So that's kind of the initial response, and that it's a festival and a holiday. Now, the underneath story, in addition to the holiday, is what we'll hear in chapter 9. Any questions at this point? Yeah. Hutch.
Recurrent biblical theme, the Jewish exile who does very well in a foreign country. And this echoes the Joseph story where Joseph becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man, just
right,
as Mordecai does in this story. So
right,
it's a repetitive story. The other thing I see is ethics have really gone down the tube here. Good ethics, I think.
Okay.
In that, this irrevocable decree business right away smacks of the king has every right in the world to change his mind on anything. The irrevocable decree is, I think, good storytelling. If he revokes his decree, he, quote, loses face.
Right.
And again, we see a recurrent biblical theme. King Herod's confronted with the same problem when after the dance, I'll give you anything you want.
Right.
That sort of thing. But so what spins out of this is justice. It simply will reverse Haman's decree, and now the Jews get to kill. So I would call this ethically lacking in that it's justice without mercy.
I think that's a good critique. It's a critique somewhat influenced by modern, not only Christianity, but humanism. And so it's, and by that, it's not a criticism. So yes, that shouldn't happen. But in that context and in that day, it was probably exaggerated, just to restate that. But it has this sense of the good guys get to do what they think is right to protect themselves. And at least with Haman and his 10 sons, he's been a risk. And so the theory is, well, we'll wipe out the person who was a risk to us. Again, however many people were literally killed is a different story. And how much of that was defense, how much of that was aggressive and going after what it says, even women and children. It does say 4 times, and we'll listen for it, but they didn't take the booty, what they could have taken. So they didn't do that. Yes, sir.
They didn't get the right to kill, they got the right to defend themselves.
Right, and that's a way to argue it.
Instead of, once the law goes on the books, even today, it's on the books.
Right.
You issue a new law, it takes it off the books. So saying that you can't revoke it and so forth, that's just a matter of semantics. And
Yeah.
I just find it difficult to place our ethical values today on those people back then.
Right.
Besides that, this is just a story.
It is a story, I think. The ethical issue, the honor of the king or the institution. So, there's the individual of the king, but you hear this even now with the King of England or Queen of England, you hear it with the Pope, that there really is something to that. So undoing the king's command or edict is a thing. So it seems to be real. Now, even in our country, like you said, if Congress passes law, the president signs it, whatever new law is against that, like the 19th Amendment, prohibition, 20th Amendment, whichever one it was, it took a lot of work. You could just say, no, that was a mistake. You had to undo that in some way. That took a lot of time.
Sometimes it only takes an executive order.
Sometimes, yeah. And especially executive orders are, again, putting our modern context on an ancient world. That's a different animal and a different discussion.
Last 4 years.
Yeah. So a lot of variations, but that's not quite what the king's command was, I don't think. All right, so let's keep going. So chapter 9, we'll just go through this quickly. And the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, and keep track of these days, it's a little confusing. When the king's command and edict were about to be executed. So that first one, they could have, wiped out everybody on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain power over them. So not only kill them, but also to the degree of their wealth, their possessions and so forth, but which had been changed to a day when the Jews could gain power or would gain power over their foes. So just like with Haman and Mordecai, there's going to be this inversion. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who had sought their ruin, and no one could withstand them because the fear of them had fallen upon all peoples. So, again, this, whatever the status was before, that now with this new sheriff in town, so to speak, they were supported, and that going on in verse 3, all the local officials supporting the Jews. So that's really kind of the balance of power change, that it was these people going after them, but now with this new edict, the Jews are after them, and it may have been more or less an equal fight, but the people in charge and the people with more, things like armies and so forth are on the side of the Jews now. So that is going to help them in this fight. Mordecai, verse 4, Mordecai was powerful in the king's house. His fame spread throughout all the provinces. Again, this is where you think it's probably a story because we don't have a record of Mordecai. Doesn't mean someday an archaeologist may find one, but as of right now, we don't have a record of this powerful person. So the Jews struck down all their enemies with a sword. slaughtering and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews, so that's the capital, one of the four capitals, but then also the outlying area. So it happens on different days in different ways. They destroy 500 people, which is a lot, not 75,000 like it's coming later, but they destroy them and they kill these individuals. And what I read in the notes again today is that those individuals, when they read the scroll for Purim, these are kind of funny sounding names, I guess, maybe in the original or in, but it's said in a way, it's almost a comic thing, even though it's talking about killing people. But these people are killed. The 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, but first time, they did not touch the plunder. So anything they could have taken, and that, again, you have to kind of read back into it about the Amalekites, about not taking their stuff, just to wipe them out, but not take their stuff and to make that something you give away or destroy, rather, is part of it. Then that very day, the number of those killed in the citadel was reported to the king. The king said to Esther, in the citadel, they've killed these numbers of people, the 10 sons of Haman, 500 people. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? So he's kind of asking Esther for an update. And what is your petition now? Because again, want to be sure you're happy that this is what is completing everything that you feel needs to be done. Verse 13, Esther said to the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. Give them a bonus day, so to speak. And then, and this is kind of the public, making a point in this gruesome way to the sons of Haman are killed already, but to hang them on the gallows. So that, again, in kind of medieval history, like cutting off the head and putting it on the spikes on the walls. This is that same type of, here's what happened to the sons of the person who tried to go after the Jews. So it was done. They got the extra day and they killed 300 people. So they did 500 the first day in the capital, 300 on the second day. But again, second time, they did not touch the plunder. Now, the other Jews in outlying areas, out in the provinces, they gathered to defend themselves. They gained relief from their enemies and killed 75,000. So again, I've done research and talked to some people. Even in a story, that's hyperbole. That would be a lot of people in that day. But they laid no hands on the plunder, third time. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. And on the 14th day, they rested. So it's like this great, I don't know if you call it a military victory, but some defending themselves victory. But then they also follow that by a day of rest and a day of feasting and gladness. And then this is, again, the origin story for Purim. Verse 18, the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and the 14th day and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. So there are two different ways of it being observed. Scholars that I read said that it probably originated out in the countryside, out in the provinces, and then was brought into the major urban areas. And that's why there's a little bit of difference in how it's celebrated. So that's kind of a detail of the holiday if you're interested in that. Mordecai recorded these things, verse 20, sent letters to all the Jews and enjoining them they should keep this. So it's not only what happened in the great victory, but in the remembrance of the great victory. And again, the point for the Jewish people going forward, just like Hutch was saying with the story of Joseph or Daniel or now Esther, that even in a foreign land that God will provide, though it doesn't say that clearly, but that there's a way of them being protected, some of that through the wits of their leaders, people like Mordecai and Esther, and some through God's, providence for them. So they began this feast as a regular way of remembering. We'll take another break. Thoughts, questions? Okay, Hutch.
Sort of a horrible turn, in the creation story on the seventh day, God rested. After this horrible slaughter, the Jews rested. Not very pretty.
It's not. It is, again, to our sensibility, different, but it's a way of, of acknowledging God's protection. I mean, I hate to make it too modern and too much in our world, but remember VJ Day? I don't, but my dad does. He was in Burma, and that joy, horrible. All that history was horrible, and Hiroshima, and that's pretty awful. But the joy of the end of the conflict and the safety of your people. So it's not that foreign to us in terms of our, even 60, 70-year-old history. What other thoughts or comments?
The other interesting thing is those thousands that were slaughtered. The Bible never says they went on attack, that there was an actual battle. Just that the Jews marched in and killed them.
Yeah, the details are pretty vague, and that could again be maybe an indication of it not being, a historical event. But the way I read between the lines almost is that they had their authorization, they're kind of gathering, they're working to do their violence, and things switch, and they gather, and maybe because they weren't expecting that made that even more of an effective defense.
It did say that they hated them, though. That these are people that hated the Jews.
Right. So yeah, there's definitely a view of this is justified. So these are people who would have wiped them out. And the idea is perhaps, again, going back to the conquest of the promised land, you don't make treaties with the people who are going to wipe you out. Now, that was an ongoing debate in Joshua and Judges, just how much that did or did not happen. But the idea is you have to kind of cut out the cancer. And so that was at least part of how that's understood. Again, it's a story. So how much it happened, we don't know. All right, well, let's wrap it up, and then we might be able to do a little bit of looking forward to our next weeks and months ahead. All right, so verse 23 was the custom of what we're doing, what the Jewish people are doing. Verse 24, again, kind of restates the story and uses that Agagite term, so that connection with the Amalekites. And that he had done it somehow in this way of casting lots, maybe to say, is this something I can accomplish? So whatever the superstition, lots would have been, kind of like dice would be the closest to our world, but that he had wanted to use that as kind of whatever his religious beliefs to say, yes, this is going to be successful, but those lots had been instead turned on him. So in verse 25, when Queen Esther changed everything, verse 26, therefore these days are called Purim. So again, this ironic twist in a sense of the word from the word Pura, which thus, because all of that was written in this letter and of what they had faced in this matter and of what had happened to them. And so that was their established custom. That it should be remembered. So a little bit redundant, but saying the same thing. The end of verse 28, these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So again, this is an unusual festival because most of the Jewish festivals go back to what book?
Passover.
Right, but in which biblical book?
Exodus.
Yeah, so in the Torah, in Exodus, that those are kind of these key 3 festivals where men are supposed to come and gather, and there are different ways. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Booths, Sukkot. There's certain feasts that are rooted there. And then hundreds of years later is this new one. And it's given the same elevation in terms of how it should be remembered as those origin feasts. So Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with the Jew Mordecai, gave full written authority, confirming the second letter about Purim, about making it a holiday. Letters were sent wishing peace and security to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom, and giving orders that these should be observed at their appointed season. So that is a Jewish custom, and it seems to imply that it almost is something, though it's Jewish, is also part of the Persian culture, that there's like a public celebration. And it's a remembrance of how the Jewish people were protected. some have given it, and it's not a perfect comparison, to something like what we do at Mardi Gras, that it's, different reasons for Mardi Gras, but it's like this celebration, this huge remembrance before kind of going the other way. It's, the fasting of Lent. There's actually developed several hundred years after this, a custom called the Fast of Esther. Some of you may have read of. So there's a short period of fasting right before you go into Purim, which is this time of celebration.
I know it's still celebrated today because one day Gordon was in the cafeteria and a man, another doctor shared his pastry with Gordon.
Yeah.
He said it was Purim, and because from the book of Esther, and Gordon went home and read the whole book of Esther.
Wow.
Because he wanted to know what Purim
Yeah.
was.
If you couldn't hear online, Ruth was saying how Gordon was at work and a doctor gave him this little pastry. And that in the pastry, in the giving of the pastry, the doctor said it's because it's Purim, and that Gordon is a good, curious person, went home and read the book of Esther, which is great. And I think I told you at one point that we took a youth group, maybe it was a confirmation class, to the local synagogue in my former church, and we just happened to hit pay dirt. We're on Purim, so we're sitting off to the side, and afterwards we had tons of those little pastries, probably dozens, if not hundreds of pastries. And of course, a hospitality gesture. They were very welcoming, and we had a great time, and had all these 14 and 15-year-olds with a sugar high. It was great. But they were good. But they were like real super sweet, kind of small squares is what I had. So the king laid tribute on the land. He'd given kind of this tax break early on, but kings change and their priorities change. And again, this is kind of wrapping up the story, that there are other accounts of him, especially as it relates to Mordecai, and that they're in the annals of the kings of Media and Persia, which is a similar phrase that was used in Samuel and in Kings, and those books, that, it's written in these annals, which unfortunately we don't have. Same thing here. If we find those annals and learn this all really happened, that will be, whoever finds that will get a lot of recognition. But again, like Joseph in Egypt, Mordecai was next in rank to the king. And that's kind of the conclusion. Now, what might be interesting, and I didn't ask Hutch in advance, I don't think Louise is on, is she? Is any of the italicized parts of Esther that you think would be worth reviewing with us? Or just talking about at a high level?
I cannot tell a lie. I didn't read them.
Oh, okay, well, then that's good not to tell a lie. But if you remember, Louise and Hutch both talked about it in their Jerusalem Bible, which is a Catholic translation, there are versions, or there are portions that are italicized, which lets the reader know it wasn't in the original. But that at least part of what it seems to be, going back to, I think, the Septuagint, so some period of time before Christ, that it would have been a way of kind of cleaning up the theology. And so there are prayers added that Esther would have prayed, or Mordecai would have prayed. And the idea is their acknowledgement that this wasn't just them being, cunning, it was God helping them. And so, not right or wrong, but again, to help us understand how the Bible evolves, that those extra parts are not, however you understand the authority of the Bible, it's not in that original work, and has been
God
added.
is in the italicized. I did see that much.
Yeah.
God is mentioned.
Right. And so when someone like me gets up and says Esther doesn't have God mentioned directly, that's why people added God, because it's hard to be in the Bible and not mention God. So. But some of these books like Esther, Ruth is like this to some degree, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, but they're books added into the record that aren't maybe the same worldview or piety that some of us think of when we think of the Bible. So it's a little bit different. So that's Esther. Any final comments before we move on and start talking about what's next? Yeah, Ruth.
You know how they repeated and we didn't touch the plunder?
Right. Yeah, 4 times. And those
Do you think that was to say we're not like those other people there who did?
partly, and remember, they were authorized to. So as far as the king's edict, they have that authority to do that. And them not doing it, it probably ties back when I was reading it today to that whole Amalekite thing and God's original command not to do that, but to just burn it and get rid of it because they don't want their conquest or their violence to be for the typical way you would do that in warfare, that you do it to get not only for this, but to get all the goods of your enemy. So it'd be a different, that they were defending themselves without trying to do to the others what they wanted to do to them. So
They're sort of making up for Saul's sin.
right. That's what I'm saying. And
Yeah.
thank you for saying it more succinctly. So because Saul did not do that, that was kind of this hanging, part of the Jewish heritage that needed to be rectified. So. Brought anybody online? Any thoughts? Are you glad we read Esther?
Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to sell the story. It's a good story. But we are wrapping it up. Now, the next thing, which we've talked about, and we can talk about a couple of different things since we have some time. Father Tom is going to be doing Job. We're going to take a break next week. So everybody kind of relax your biblical scholarship, but come back. Don't use that as an excuse not to come back. So not this Wednesday, the 27th, but the following Wednesday, the 3rd, I believe, of November. We'll start on probably a study of Job through the end of the year. And has anyone ever been in a book study of the book of Job? So you have, Hutch? Oh, Louise is on now.
Yeah. Thank you. Father Rick, one of these things we went through Job several years ago.
So I'll let Tom give the overview, but just a few things. I took a whole course on it in seminary, so I know enough to be dangerous. And one of my people I really respect, Carol Newsom, was on faculty there and is retired now, but she's a scholar, written 3 books now, I think, on Job, 2 books for sure. One, and it's a little dense, but it's called Job, The Contest for the Moral Imagination. So that's the subheading. And it's this thick. But some of the key points is that Job is a critique of standard religious belief, including Jewish belief, but frankly, a lot of Christian belief. But because of that, it has things, literary elements that say, well, this is awful. I don't want God to be like this. But it's not God, it's kind of our image of God that's being looked at from a poetic point of view and then criticized in some ways. And so if you're patient and can hang in there, like the one way I think Carol talked about it is that opening thing. It's like Satan is apparently in the court of Yahweh and he's like searching things out, kind of like a quality control inspector, and reporting back to Yahweh with the other angels or sons of God. So this is kind of an ancient, almost folk tale, right? So I would invite you not to think of it as a documentary, right? It's a story that's going to help move the plot along, which a lot of it is going to be in the middle part. But that Satan gets God to agree to do these awful things, which again, is this how it works? I would suggest probably not, but it kind of gets the story going. And this one understanding of God would be the way it's described in the first chapter or 2, that he can be persuaded to do bad things to people. And to remember the Jewish people really, their beliefs is that because God is all powerful, nothing bad happens that God doesn't do. And so that's where you get into a theology that looks at issues of evil. And that's important stuff to work on. How does evil exist? Is God doing the evil, or is God indifferent to evil, or is there something more? Which points us to the Christian message that God, whatever freedom causes in us to do what's wrong, or just what is in the nature of creation, that God isn't this either punitive, cruel dictator, nor is he indifferent, but God is right there alongside of us. So that God, we believe as Christians, became one of us. As it says in the Eucharistic prayer, he lived and died as one of us. So God's with us. And when awful things happen, not to assume we've done something wrong, there's usually more to it. And that worldview that says, well, if something bad has happened to you, you've sinned. That's kind of the core critique in Job. So just know if you either hold that view or struggled with that view, know that view is going to be part of the conversation. So all these bad things happen. His wife says, why don't you just curse God and die? So yeah, it's awful. He loses all his kids, his wealth, his health. And then he has counselors that come and sit alongside of him. And anyone who's a Stephen minister or does any type of lay pastoral care, They don't say anything for 7 days, which they get a lot of heat later, criticism. But to their credit, they just sit with Job for 7 days, don't say a word. But then at some point, because Job is suffering and saying all these things, they start speaking out. And each of those 3 friends will speak out, kind of defending God or their understanding of God, and that Job must be at fault. So anyway, that's giving you a preview, probably more than I need to. But it also helps with our understanding of the Bible. How does the Bible work? How the Bible does not work is to take a verse, because it's literature. A verse can be pithy and you want to remember it, and there are parts that are important. But stories like Job, it's you got to be sure you read the whole book. So that's what Tom will be doing with us. Any questions about that or comments on the Job portion? You looking forward to Job?
Yeah.
Woo! Okay, good. Job's a heavy book, but Job is an important book. Yeah, Hutch.
I've read the chapter 1 and the last chapter of Job were added later.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a nice way to segue into the story, but these things were plastered on later, maybe to make more sense out of it, which is a way confusing to more.
Could be. I mean, that's one interpretation. Another is that the first chapter or 2 and the last chapter 2, if you took them and put them together, were a whole, and a more ancient story and a more simplistic story, again, more of a folk tale. And that in between, it's like this is again a theory, but either there might have been multiple authors or one author said, okay, I'm going to use this as my bookends, and then put the in between, which is a critique of the bookends. But you can pay your money and take your choice. If you want extra credit, read Job, The Contest of the Moral Imagination by Carol Newsom, but it isn't easy. So I'm not selling it very well, but it is a good book. It's pretty in-depth. What other Job thoughts? And then we'll do one other thing before we wrap up today. Next, after Job, and assuming that runs through the end of the year, more or less, is what do we want to do next? We've talked about it some. I've talked to some of you one-on-one, and some of you have talked to me. Are you ready to maybe change things up and maybe do something from the New Testament? Next thing I would want to do is like wisdom literature if we say in the Old Testament. So whether that's Psalm, okay. Okay. Anyone want to keep it the way it is and keep kind of going book by book going forward? That's also an option. If we do New Testament, the one way, you can do it different ways, but the lectionary gospel, we have one main gospel each lectionary year. So the one coming up is Luke. So one obvious thing we could do is the Gospel of Luke, but do it not by the lectionary, but kind of go through verse and chapter by chapter. So that's one option we could do, or we could do something totally different. I would recommend, let's not do Revelation. When I've left it open to groups before, they say, let's do Revelation. Perfectly good book. It's a little bit after Job. That's kind of what Leela did. I think she just did Revelation of Job in her book study. So we could do a letter of Paul. We could do a couple of letters of Paul, or we could do something else. But what do you think?
I think Luke, because we went through a bunch of the letters with Rick.
Did you?
Paul's been pushed aside a long time. No,
No, I like Paul, and Paul's good too. I mean, I like the whole thing. I swore that it was the word of God, so I'm kind of on the hook for it. So Luke is one thing. Any other suggestions? Because again, it's really, and again, Luke, if we do it, of course, will be, that'll be a longer commitment, probably take us a month or two for sure, maybe longer, which is good. Studying Jesus is kind of important. No other suggestions? Y'all need to think about it, come back. The other thing Tom and I are thinking about doing is that how the Bible actually works, maybe take a week or two to review that. So that might be our bridge. So finish Job, maybe take a break around Christmas, do that to begin the year, and then go into Luke. Does that sound like a plan? Cool. All right. So we're getting out a little bit early, which is perfectly fine. And again, I'll send out the email. We're not going to meet this week. we will, this coming week, so a week from today, but we'll start that first Wednesday in November and read as much of Job as you'd like. I'll go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Alleluia. Alleluia.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Hallelujah.
All right. Y'all take care.